Thanks for joining. So today we're going to talk about Webex Calling Dedicated Instance in particular, and how to or aspects of migration from your existing, on-premise or privately owned or XCS instance of Communication Manager, and things to consider about migration in terms of going your endpoints, etc., your phones, etc., moving over to dedicated instance, and things to consider from a testing point of view. Okay, so the agenda we'll cover today is we'll just a quick refresher as always on UnifiedFX as in ourselves. I use the term preferred solution partner because I'm very lazy, and Cisco have changed the entire program over, and I haven't got around to, although we've re-registered and all that, I haven't got around to update my slides, so that's on me. It's always a nuisance when they change these things and update and refresh, and all the other slide decks have to go, so I haven't done that. So really, in terms of Webex crawling migration, and this is really, there's two kind of aspects to this. The main content of what I'm going to talk about today all relates to dedicated instance. It's all about moving your phones, really, the endpoint side of it, over. This isn't a configuration management. That's other tools and other people that do that. This is really for the endpoint side of it. That's our bread and butter, and where I think we add the most value, at least our product set. That's kind of one the core part of this presentation. But in the roadmap at the end, we're actually going to talk about things we have planned in terms of MTP phones, room devices, CE devices, etc., and things like that. So there's really kind of two main parts, but we obviously won't go into too much detail in terms of the future aspects, but we do have a sign-up link for you at the end if you want to participate in our early field trial, if you do have MPP phones, etc. But the core content for this session is just going into a bit of detail about moving your existing enterprise phones over to Webex Calling Dedicated Instance. So we're going to give you an overview of the things to consider. Then we're going to talk about some of the key actions that, in particular, our PhoneView software can help you with, a little demo on part of that. And then we're going to talk about the kind of call testing aspect of things. In particular, we've got a nice little demo that shows you how to test E911. Then we'll go into the roadmap and just if there's any time for questions at the end. So as a recap in terms of UnifiedFX, we've got three main products. So we've got PhoneView, which is really the kind of main product we'll talk about today. Can do basically anything with Cisco phones remotely. Enterprise phones, obviously, at the moment. It's already used and has been used for years and years, etc., to work with quite literally millions of Cisco phones across hundreds and thousands of customers. So, very mature product and used quite extensively. We also have a wallboard product, which is really geared currently still against Cisco UCCX. That is something we're going to look to extend in the future, but right now that is just a core focus of it. And we really packaged it really carefully so that it's really incredibly simple to install, just do it yourself, upgrade yourself, etc. 100% browser based. There's no need for any extra stuff or plugins. Can work with smart TVs and all those kind of things. And it's engineered at all levels to be incredibly fast in terms of real-time updates. In fact, I would easily argue it's the fastest real-time updates of any wallboard products that we've ever come across. And then finally, there's MigrationFX, which is something that we put together on request of Cisco to make it easy to swap old phones for new. To be fair, probably most people have done what they need to do with MigrationFX over the last few years, but there's still maybe some customers, maybe even as part of moving to Webex in the future, Webex calling in the future, that might still need to swap out some phones. So still there, still kicking, and still making life easy for people. So in terms of the quick overview of what to consider from a migration perspective for migrating endpoints, really you don't want to start with inventory, so all the devices that you've got, etc., and relevant information. Then you want to validate that if there's any kind of planning and preparation you need to consider, which you obviously would then do. That preparation that you would do then leads into the actual migration itself. And ultimately there'll be some testing. Now, testing's really incremental and iterative as part of all of it, but I've kind of lumped it at the end there because you'll definitely do probably a bulk of your testing at the end, if not in between. In terms of inventory and the validation side of it, that's where you might want to obviously check model compatibility. If you're on an older version of Communication Manager, when you get to kind of Communication Manager 12.5 and beyond, that's where you have some restrictions on model deprecation. So, you might have some devices that you need to look to upgrade. If you are looking to go either now or in the future at some point to MPP registered devices, so there is some considerations in terms of the hardware revision of some phone models. You can see on that table there, we've pilfered out from Cisco's website. If Mohammed hasn't done it already, maybe ask if Mohammed could post the link. We've got a link to the relevant blog post for that talks about the migration of the enterprise links and stuff. So coming up at some point. Oh, that's a good question from Kyle. Do you have a MigrationFX webinar coming up at some point? Yeah, that's right. We haven't got one scheduled, but what we had been slow to get organised, to be fair, because we've got lots of stuff been working on, which we'll maybe cover at the end. But yeah, we're going to do a set of webinars, all kind of series, just even if it's just a refresher on all the products and what they kind of do. So to be fair, we might not start that until the new year, but we'll let you know ahead of time when it's all kind of scheduled. But obviously, if there's anything imminently, just feel free to reach out to us at any point. And, do obviously one-to-one sessions as well. Yeah, we'll probably do have a recorded one. So Mohammed, I don't know if you're there at all. Yep, you posted that link. If you maybe could dig out the link for the MigrationFX webinar as well, and you could post that over to Kyle, that'd be handy. Thank you. Okay, so obviously hardware revision, that's something to consider. ITL file management is probably the main crux that makes migrating phones to Webex Calling Dedicated Instance a bit of a challenge, and we've certainly been reached out by Cisco and other parties quite a lot recently, looking for that base level ITL delete functionality that our software is probably pretty well known for and executes incredibly well. So we'll talk about that obviously in more detail. Static TFTP server, so it's again one of those things that you think about maybe by accident or deliberately. You've got some devices or a lot of devices with static TFTP server settings. That's going to be a problem if you're going to try to move phones over, because you're going to have to clear or update those. Firmware level, obviously, to consider that to make sure ideally everything's up to date and to the target level for where you're going to need to be before you kind of cut over. One thing is it's generally recommended to have phone web access enabled. I see a question coming in there in terms of is it mandatory? Nothing's mandatory with PhoneView, to be fair. We can do a lot without the phone's web server being enabled. However, the inventory aspect of it, a lot of that data we really get directly from the phone's webpage, and it's the only place you can get some information, things like the ITL status and the hardware revision. We can only get that, or even the alt TFTP state, we can only get it from the phone's web server. We do get from Communication Manager a list of all your devices, models, and IP address and all those good useful data too. So you never get a base level inventory without the phone's web access being enabled. We just get more value basically when you do that. So it's the kind of thing that we recommend to do even just temporarily prior to an upgrade or a project or something. But it's not mandatory. It's just something to do if you can do, basically, and you'll get more value back from that if you can do it. So in terms of preparation, so once you've kind of gathered your data and done your validation, there might obviously be some hardware upgrades you need to perform. So obviously that's where MigrationFX comes in. If you do have some older phone models, etc., that you do need to replace, it does make it crazy simple to swap those phones over. Certificate management, primarily in terms of ITL, CTL files on the phone. Generally speaking, that can be one of the biggest challenges for moving phones between clusters, and I'll go into that obviously more detail in a minute. The simplest recommendation that we have, without even querying or analysing anything, is just simply delete all ITL or CTL files. Even before you do the actual migration, just delete them all. And the reason why we recommend that is it has a non-detrimental effect when you do it. Effectively, if there was a bad ITL file, it will clear it and get rid of it. And as much as we have mechanics to gather, ITL information such as ITL Status and ITL Signature, sometimes it's better to just delete it, because if it's good, it makes no issue. If you delete it, it'll just put a fresh, good certificate back in. So generally, we just recommend that, and it actually makes your project simpler, to be fair. Again, however, having said that, we're kind of fortunate because the PhoneView software is incredibly good at doing bulk ITL deletes. You might hear in one of my videos or something if I play the right one. We have examples of customers deleting, 50,000 plus ITL files in a single 4-hour change window. So scaling performance is not an issue when it comes to that type of operation. So it really just sometimes easier just to delete it. And it has a minimum level of disruption. It does interact with the phone. It will kick the phone out for registration and re-register, etc. So obviously, because on a call at a time, you don't want to do it. But if you do it, in a change window, evening time, something like that, you're not really going to affect anybody. So it's all kind of good to do. That's generally a recommendation that we make. Firmware upgrade and validation. So obviously, you want to make sure you got all the software levels upgraded on your firmware and check that it's all at the right levels if they weren't already. And if you do identify any anomalies from a TFTP server point of view, any statically set settings or things like that, then you can obviously update those settings. Generally, as part of the preparation, again, this is not mandatory, it just helps for those edge cases, is that if you do this preparation step, which is set the authentication URL to an HTTP, non-secure HTTP URL, using the actual IP address of the communication manager, for example, that effectively bypasses all dependencies on anything to do with ITL files or TBS files. And it means if you do get that updated authentication URL on the phone, it's almost bulletproof that we can then control it remotely in almost any situation, even when the phone's unregistered. So it's like a price you pay, but the reward you get is more coverage in terms of scenarios and edge cases. But again, it's not mandatory. PhoneView works incredibly well using CTI and its queuing engine, so you don't need to do it. But it just means that in real world terms, we see plenty of customers where they've got thousands of devices and they're deleting ITL files, moving phones between clusters. And it's just very common that there's some stragglers and things that go wrong with individual devices. And if you do these extra preparation steps, it just gives you options to possibly resolve those remotely without any physical attendance. So that's all about best case scenario with the most preparation. The actual migration itself, when you're moving phones between clusters fundamentally, so from your existing on-prem cluster to the Webex Calling Dedicated Instance, you might want to move individual phones, for example, it's just a proof of concept or testing with certain users, etc. Then one of the things, and I'll go into it in detail in a little demo as well, it's actually very helpful just to be able to individually set the TFTP server on those select devices and point it to the Webex Calling Dedicated Instance TFTP server, basically. And that means you can selectively move those phones over, test them, do whatever you want, and then once you're confident and happy, you can then do the rest of them, do your bulk or your site level migration, which would either be basically deleting ITL files, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, or setting the TFTP server. You can do that en masse as well if you want to just kind of bypass any of the DHCP option 150 dependencies that you'd normally have to do. But again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. There's also things that as I'm trying to allude to, that you might need to consider is handling anomalies, such as phones that just don't behave as you would expect them to and end up possibly unregistered and things like that. Now, if you did enable the web server on the phone as part of that kind of inventory step, then part of the data that our software gathers is switch and port details. So what that would then allow you to do later on, if you do end up with some of those anomalies and some unregistered devices, you can then go back to the specific switch and port power cycle, that phone remotely, with the relevant no shutdown command. And hopefully, if you're lucky, those phones, or some of them at least, might come kick back into life and then register either to the old cluster or hopefully to the new one, and you can maybe repeat the process if necessary. So that's why I'm kind of leaning heavy on recommending the inventory and data gathering kind of side of it. It generally pays back down the line if things don't go as planned. So now I want to talk, that was kind of like the overview of all the kind of steps to consider. So now I want to talk about a couple of key actions that you may perform, and obviously PhoneView can help you with these. And what I really want to talk about is a little bit more about ITL status, how to understand it, the data that we can query and get from the phone, if it is available in terms of the phone's web server. So if you do go through that step and you have that data, it's a bit more information you can work with. So I'll explain that. Also, it is possible to get the ITL Signature for some models, so we'll talk about that as well. The recommendations that we make, which I've touched on already in terms of the settings to do, as I say, they are a recommendation, they are not mandatory, and it's all about best case success if you do follow those recommendations. A little bit more detail on how we work with unregistered phones. And then the crux of the matter, which is really moving phones between clusters. That's really what the whole webinar is about, is the mechanic to enable and make that process sweet and smooth. And as part of that, an option and a variant is to set and update TFTP servers. So in terms of understanding ITL status, when you use PhoneView to do that asset inventory kind of step, assuming that you have enabled the phone's web server, then you get access to this ITL status information. And generally, this table kind of breaks down what you would typically see in most scenarios from a response point of view, a little explanation of what that generally means and if you need to do anything about it. So the two positive scenarios are ITL installed or trustless updated. So that means that you've got a properly installed ITL file, or that the phone has been rebooted at some point and picked up a fresh and valid ITL file. So that's those first two rows. So if they're all good, then nothing needs to happen. Your phones are healthy and good to go. If you get the third row, which is called no ITL installed, now that might be by design, because maybe you've set, for example, the pre-UCM8 rollback setting. That's the enterprise parameter. So you may have done that to kind of try and disable ITL files. So maybe that's what you've chosen to do. And if you have, then that's all fine. But if it's not what you did, or you didn't enable pre-UCM8 rollback, then you might have an issue. And again, the safe bet is just to try enabling, just disable or delete rather that ITL file. Then if you get, this is probably the main error message that we see, if you get a message that says trust list update failed, that's the fourth row there, then that typically means there's a bad ITL file, or there's something wrong, at least in the certificate side on the handset. So that is the best case scenario where you would always delete an ITL file. So you ever see trust list update failed, you definitely need to delete that ITL file, no questions asked. And the last two, somebody added a little while back actually, but it's useful, is there are occasions, if you haven't enabled the phone's web server, where obviously we can't get that data, so therefore we'll report unknown or unreachable. So that's perfectly valid that you don't have the web server enabled, and you would get that status response back, obviously. And if that is the way that you're doing it and you haven't enabled that phone's web server, that's simple, just delete the ITL file. And you can still do that because PhoneView primarily uses CTI to control and communicate with the phone. So it doesn't even touch the phone's web server when it's controlling it. That's the power of the software, why it can work so well in almost any scenario is because it's the CTI driven. Not the only way that it works, which I'll touch on in a second, but that's the main benefit of it and why it doesn't require the web server to be enabled. You just get more flexibility in data if you do. And then the last one there, unknown no data. It's unusual, but the way we get ITL status is we look at the log file on the phones itself, and we parse the data in there. But that log file only holds so many log entries, basically. So if the phone's been on for a long, long time, and maybe some other activities have happened on it, it might flush out any ITL-related messages out from the log on the phone. So we can't get any. So we can communicate with the phone, but we can't get anything out of the log file of use relating to ITL files. That's the status that would report unknown no data. Generally, the recommendation is either reset the phone, so it does kind of refresh the log file with the latest ITL data as it reboots, and then you can requery, and you should get one of those other statuses if you do that. So that's one step you can perform. However, as I maybe said more than once now, you can always just delete the ITL file. That's why it is the recommendation. There is no bad consequences, only positive when you do that. So another aspect of working with the ITL files and understanding them is we can also gather the ITL signature information. Now, this is something that Cisco added a good few years ago. And just in case you're not aware, the concept of ITL status, it was ourselves that invented that because we've been working with people from day dot on ITL issues, and we realised that there was a way we could parse data from the phone's webpage and get from the log file and extract a concept that would relate to the status of the ITL file. So Cisco didn't publish a way to get ITL status. We just found a way from the information that was available and made the best of it. And a couple of other companies have kind of copied that, to be fair. So that's a kind of, a key aspect that we added to the equation in terms of inventory and discovery. But down the line, Cisco then did add in this ITL signature, so you did have more of an accurate and concise way to check the ITL file itself. The downside is they only added it on current phones at that point, which was the 7800, 8800 and 1900 series. So the older 7800 series, you cannot get an ITL signature from them, unfortunately, because they were past their update end of life cycle at that stage when Cisco decided to add this information. So we obviously take advantage of that. That's a separate command, CMD security info, or you can do it via the GUI as well. And that ultimately will query all that data. There's a separate column that holds all the ITL file signature, and you can just validate that. The way that it works is there's a unique kind of fingerprint that goes against each TFTP server. So if you've got one TFTP server, all the ITL signature should be the same. If you get two TFTP servers, you have two sets. So depending on which server the phone talked to pick up its ITL file, have one of either signatures. And if you find that there are signatures that your phone has that doesn't match your current TFTP server signatures, that's when you have a problem. So it's really those extra signatures or invalid signatures are what you're trying to find to identify if you have a problem. And that would typically tie in with some of those ITL status messages like trust list update failed or something like that. So it's another tool in your toolbox, so to speak, to try and discover where any problems might be. But ultimately, we're just using the best we can with information available to us. So this is like a one-pager for the recommendations. So I kind of touched on some of this in the previous slides. And again, these are not mandatory. This is just things that we suggest, but if you can't do it, it is okay. You can still use our software to good benefit. This just, as I said earlier, covers those edge cases. So some customers, this is maybe worth mentioning, it's quite rare, but we have had some customers that have had the settings menu in the phone set to disabled or restricted, obviously for privacy security reasons, and that's their choice, and that's absolutely fine. The unfortunate thing is, if you have a phone that has that menu setting, disabled or restricted, you cannot delete the ITL file unless you change the setting back to its default, to unlock it. or enable it. So it's one of those things that you can end up in a situation where if you have got the settings menu disabled or restricted and a ITL file breaks or gets out of sync, for lack of a better phrase, unfortunately, you will not be able to delete the ITL file anymore, because it won't trust Call Manager to get any changes to its settings menu. So it ends up in a kind of catch-22 lock state. So that's why I always get you to, or recommend our customers to double check that the settings menu are enabled, because it's kind of like a first step sort of thing. Usually it's fine, 90+% of people, that's the default anyway, and that's what they've left it at. But it's just something to check. That's always going to save your bacon down the line if some problems going to happen. The next point, as I say, it's not mandatory, but it is a recommendation, is to enable the phone's web server. Even as the bullet point says there, it may just be for the upgrade or the migration phase, for a week or two as you're doing all your work to change things over. So you don't have to leave it on permanently, but it is useful at least to do that data gathering. Obviously, you can enable that with an enterprise-wide phone configuration to turn it on. Some customers, maybe over time, they've had individual phone device configurations updated statically to turn web access on or off, whatever. So you can end up, like, generally it could be enabled, but maybe on specific devices it's been turned off, and it can be a little bit hard to discover those devices. PhoneView has this web server online field in its data view, and that actually helps you to discover those, even just from a network connectivity point of view, because whenever you perform a query, we update that web server online, basically kind of true false, to give you feedback as to whether or not we were able to talk to the phone's web server. So if it is reachable, we can kind of confirm that. So if you do find that even if you have turned it on enterprise wide and reset everything and everything should be okay, if you do a query across all your devices with PhoneView, and you can double check with that web server online and just make sure everything has updated as you would want it to or expect it to. So that's a good double check, basically. And then the last point, main point here, is the authentication URL. Is typically something you set in enterprise parameters. You can do it at the device level. That's obviously not very typical, and you probably want to kind of get rid of that, to be honest, and use the enterprise level parameter. As I've touched on before, we generally recommend that you use HTTP instead of HTTPS, so make it non-secure. I'll explain all this in a minute. And if you remember, there's two authentication URLs, the secure and the non-secure URL. Set it to HTTP for both of them. Okay, so you're kind of like copying the non-secure into the secure field. It's also helpful to use the IP address instead of the DNS hostname. Again, it's a dependency you can eliminate in terms of DNS in that case. But because if you do flip to use HTTP explicitly and basically disable HTTPS for that authentication URL, it basically eliminates TBS and ITL issues as a dependency. Now, just to explain if it's not clear, the authentication URL is something that the phone picks up in its configuration when it reboots, etc. And what happens is, if we try to push instructions to the phone's web server, now normally we do it via CTI, but we can also do it directly to the phone's web server as a fallback scenario, which I'll cover in a second. But if we do that, then the phone will use the authentication URL to check the credentials and then approve or reject the request. So obviously, if we're valid and we want it to be approved, that authentication URL is essential. And if the authentication URL is HTTPS and there's a problem with the ITL file or the TVS settings, unfortunately, that authentication URL will break. So even though it's the right credentials and even though you expect it to kind of work, if you're using HTTPS and the phone is in a kind of bad certificate state, for lack of a better phrase, unfortunately, you can't control it via the phone's web server in that situation. So again, following these recommendations, it's all best case scenario. And this means that if you do follow that even if the phone has an issue from an ITL point of view, but if it has got the phone's web server turned on and a non-secure authentication URL, we can actually still control it, even without CTI, and even if it's got an ITL issue because of those extra steps. And it just means that if you get, say, some of those anomalies with unregistered phones, etc., it just gives you a way to hopefully solve that problem. So say this is all recommendations. It's not mandatory. It's just things that, you know, if you hit those issues, it will give you a fallback position. So in terms of unregistered phones, as I've tried to describe a little earlier there, is the way PhoneView works is fundamentally it will always try to use, if it can, CTI to control the phone. So that means that the key presses, you know, to delete the ITL file and things like that, they all get sent down the signaling channel. So the existing registered connection of the phone, so that's skinny or SIP, either way, that's where the key presses get sent as per that diagram. Now, if PhoneView, when we kind of query the phone status data using a group update, if PhoneView sees that a phone is in an unregistered state, it'll actually automatically fall back and use the phone's web page, or at least attempt to use that if it's available. So it kind of tries to be kind of smart and, you know, automatically use the phone's web page if that is achievable. So that's the kind of automatic fallback component. But, you know, sometimes like doing group updates, you might lose the IP address of the phone and stuff like that. There's ways to save and import that. But, you know, in simple terms, you could actually maybe just want to choose to force the use of the HTTP. So you can optionally just straight disable CTI for that particular cluster. And if you do that, then our software will just always use HTTP in that scenario. So we just give you that flexibility. We use the best mechanism first. We're trying to automatically fall back where possible, but you can explicitly force it. And that's really what all these recommendations are for. It's really to give you options that if you do have things that just don't work right, especially when you get to unregistered phones. You know, we've seen many a customer where they've got, you know, what, 10,000, 20,000 phones, and they're, you know, doing updates or moving between clusters and things like that. And there's just sometimes there can be just a percentage, you know, a few hundred phones, 500 phones or something. They just don't act as you would expect them to, you know, with the best will in the world. You know, it can be hard to audit and make sure everything's running exactly as desired. So, you know, if that happens, then ultimately, you know, this gives you a potential solution. So that's really why we put all the effort into, you know, making those recommendations just to give you those extra scenarios. Now, the main crux of what this kind of webinar is fundamentally about really is, in simple terms, moving phones between clusters. We've got lots of experience of helping very large numbers of customers move very large numbers of phones between systems, cluster consolidations, and a whole bunch of other kind of scenarios. And I guess generally speaking, there's now obviously a wave of scenarios now where people are moving to obviously Webex Calling Dedicated Instance, and maybe down the line going to MPP, which obviously we're going to talk about a little bit at the end here. But ultimately, this is the key thing for moving phones. So the key thing here is you want to delete the ITL file at some point, right? It needs to get removed from the phone so it will trust the new cluster. Now, some people may not appreciate it, but just because you update the option 150, the phone's not just going to move. It might pick up the TFTP server for the new system it's to talk to, but the ITL file still remains, and it only trusts the old system, so it won't register. It'll go back to where it was before. So what you actually have to do is make sure you delete the ITL file after the phone has picked up the DHCP option 150. That's not just updating the scope on DHCP. You actually have to update the scope, reboot the phone, let it go back to where it originally was, and then when you delete the ITL file, it will then adopt and use and trust that option 150 setting. Okay, so it's because whenever you delete an ITL file, it just goes and gets another one. So if you haven't updated the option 150 first and you delete the ITL file, you know, ahead of time, it will just go back to the original call manager and get the old call manager's certificate, basically. Now you can obviously leverage this PhoneView set TFTP macro And whenever you do that, as part of the mechanic of when you set a TFTP server, it actually deletes the ITL file at the same time. So it's actually like 2 steps in one. So it gives you a really good control over that. And the good thing is, if you do explicitly set the TFTP server using this macro, which we'll talk about in our demo in a little minute, you don't have to coordinate anything with your infrastructure teams. So you don't have to make sure option 150 is set and all those kind of things. You can just, whenever you're choose, pick one or more phones or whole entire sites and just explicitly move them over as well. And then later on, maybe your infrastructure team will follow up with an option 150 change, and then you could clear the TFTP file to get it back to normal DHCP operation. Anyway, you've got a lot of flexibility from that perspective. In terms of the specifics of how you do this, I'm conscious of time actually, so I'm going to have to kind of rush some of this. I ended up talking more than expected. So you've got an independent macro built in. Those are the actual macro commands there, those 4 at the bottom, CMD:. So it allows us to explicitly turn on alt TFTP and set the TFTP server. Or if it's already enabled, we can update the existing primary and secondary TFTP server. Or if alt TFTP is already turned on, you use clear TFTP server to flip it back off again. So it's structured in that way. And let me show you that in action. So I've got PhoneView running here. I've just got a bunch of phones. You can hopefully see them. If I drag and select, anything I select, I control. So if I press the settings button on the keypad here, that instruction goes to all 8 selected phones. So I'm controlling all 8. I can use the keyboard. So I do 1, 2, 3 in the keyboard, and 1, 2, 3 is sent out simultaneously to all the selected devices. So that's what you call bulk operations, kind of as powerful as you can get, fully interactive at the same time. Now, I actually deliberately have one of these phones with TFTP set, and I can actually check and choose all to check all of that. So if I go to data view, this is basically all the same devices, but with the raw tabular data. And if I move over here, you can see I've got alt TFTP, it's turned off, but this one phone here has it turned on. So I'm going to clear that, right? So this is almost as though I had some existing random phones with some hard-coded TFTP, and I want to clear them, because if you don't do this, you're going to have problems later if you try to move the phone over. So you kind of want everything, you know, probably basically cleared first, is if you do have individual phones that are set. So just having that data is useful. To get this alt TFTP data, you basically select one or more phones, you go query, oops, I can use my mouse properly, device info, and choose the group that you want there. So if I go back to here, so that's the phone that already has the TFTP set. So if you look up here, we have this CMD: clear TFTP server. So this is this macro command. This is model independent. So I could have a mixture of different phone models and send this instruction. It will send automatically the right key sequence for each model. So it's super simple to use. Just choose it on this one phone. I hit send, and we'll see it's stepping through the phone's menu structure. It's turning alt TFTP from yes to no, saving that. The phone's going to do a quick kind of reset, and I'll fix it basically, right? Now, if I go back to data view here, so this data hasn't changed. You have to explicitly refresh this, right? So if we give the phone a little second just to hopefully reboot, but with that phone record selected, if I do query device info, and just even for that selected one, say that, we can see it's now flipped from yes to no, because we have changed that alt TFTP. Okay, so that's us fixing phones. That's clearing out the TFTP side of it so that they're ready to move purely on a DHCP basis, etc. Right. So that's one side of it. But let's say we actually want to specifically move those 4 phones over to another cluster, right? We don't want to move everything. We just want to choose some phones for test group or whatever, a particular site. So with those 4 phones selected, and let me just, oops, a second, find it. That's wrong. Maneuver there. Here we go. I've got my little cheat sheet. So if I go here, copy that, put that up into my command bar at the top. So what that is going to do is turn on alt TFTP and at the same time set the TFTP server to that value there. Now, in real terms, this isn't going to really do anything in terms of moving phones between clusters, because I'm just going to point it to the same cluster. But if this was the TFTP server of a different cluster, the phones would then disappear and move over there, right? Because I want to kind of don't want to break my demo system, basically. I'm just kind of showing you the mechanics, but you know, all you would do is put a different IP address in here, basically, and that would be our Webex Calling Dedicated Instance TFTP server's address that would go in there. So with these 4 selected, just to show you doing it with a few at once, I hit send on here. Actually, before I do that, just a little point to note. Only is really relevant to 7800 series, to be fair, but just to kind of show you, when I press the settings button there, you can actually see the settings menu, and the little icon is padlock icon is unlocked. If you do need to make sure the phones are unlocked, you can explicitly do that by doing a hard reset, and then once the phones come back on, you can use that little built-in macro there. But that's a 7900 series thing, just for anybody that still has those phones and has to worry about it. But we kind of have a bunch of them, so that's why we use it for our demo. But anyway, that's just a little prerequisite that if it's an older phone model, it needs to be unlocked. Okay, so just to prove that it's been done already. So if I click send, and if we watch, we can see simultaneously it's navigating the menu. It's going to that alt TFTP. This time it's turning it on to yes. It's now going to type in that IP address to all those devices simultaneously, as if by magic. Saves that. The phone will then do a quick kind of reset. And sometimes when I do this, the phone might pick up a different IP address and screenshots might stop working and I have to kind of update data. So we could lose the odd phone sometimes. So it might take a little minute before they come back. But technically, that would then move over to another cluster, basically, at this point in time. And then, you know, a few minutes later, you'd see them all registering with your Webex calling system. If I go over to data view, just to prove that, if I look at the alt TFTP column and I refresh this data, so go back to query device info, do those 4 selected. Oh, looks like it didn't work on one of them. Oh no, just a little second to come back there. So you can see it's yes, 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 yes. So it's all updated. The address didn't change, so we just kind of kept it the same anyway. And if I wanted to go back the way, just to fix my own demo environment back to where it should be, I'm just going to copy that again very quickly, send that out. So back to here, hit send. And it's going to go in and fix that. Just because of time, I'm going to jump back to the slides and carry on. I've got another kind of little section to cover. So hopefully that helps in terms of how to do the TFTP server side of it. I want to now talk about the testing. Most of this is really, I might just kind of skip through the slides kind of quickly and leave them here for kind of reference. Hopefully most of you will be aware of some of the key aspects of this in terms of obviously Carrier's Law and Rayburn's Acts, which most of them are just as a refresher and a reminder. A point to note in terms of testing, for example, things like dial plan testing, you can also work with soft phones, MRA and VPN registered devices. So pretty much, you know, the whole range of things that work against your cluster from a dial plan perspective. All can be directly controlled and tested using PhoneView. It's specifically in terms of MRA and Softphone support. We use CTI state data and we visualize a kind of rendering that shows you the kind of calling state activity of the phone, the lines, the calls on it, etc. So that allows you to see the state of the device, that for MRA or soft phones, etc. And you can work with desk phones too, obviously, but desk phones, it's kind of better if you can get a screenshot from a user experience point of view. But again, you know, back to that question at the beginning about is the phone's web server being enabled a mandatory thing? No, it's not, because if the phone's web server is not enabled, you can use this rendering technique and the CTI mechanisms along with it to control the phone. So we can always control a hard soft phone, MRA phone, you know, got just unique selling point that nobody else has figured out how to do yet. So anyway, that's one side of it is the rendering. So you can see what's happening. And then the other side is the ability to control the soft phone or MRA phone, etc. Is we have a keypad, we call it the universal keypad. This actually has logical CTI calling operations behind it. So when you do call, conference transfer, and press digits, etc., it's not remotely pressing buttons in this situation. It's actually performing a logical call operation, and that means it works with anything that can be CTI controlled. So that includes, Webex calling, register your communication manager, Jabber endpoints, etc., even old IP communicator stuff, and obviously MRA phones. So pretty much anything kind of works in that scenario. Now, when it comes to validating 911 calling, there's obviously a couple of key aspects to that to make sure it's all kind of working as expected. But if, for example, you're actually calling, the public service answer point, I mean, normally you would actually physically go to a location and sit in front of a phone you're going to test and dial it and check it. The whole point of our software is that you basically don't need to go to site to do these things. You can do it all remotely. So you can have a phone anywhere in your estate, see it, operate it remotely, and you can do two-way audio to variably confirm that it's working as expected with the public service answer point. So basically, the key thing is working remotely with doing 911 testing or any other kind of testing for that matter. And the way you want to do like two-way audio with the public service answer point, because obviously you're not physically in front of that remote phone, using that macro there as an example, what you can actually do is get the remote phone to dial 911, maybe just wait a little bit, and then perform a logical CTI call conference into your mobile number, another phone on the cluster or whatever, and that would just instantly set up do the initial calling party, which is really the test to call 911, etc., as the initial call leg, and then add in yourself or whoever to then have a mini conference call to prove that talk to the public service answer point, prove I've been set up correctly. I've got a little demo of that in a minute. Validate dispatch location. So this is really the making sure that obviously the location information tied to the relevant extension, etc., is all been set correctly. There's different ways you might approach this. I'll maybe not talk to it in too much detail. You can read the slides yourself, obviously. But ultimately, it's the kind of thing that sometimes you ask the person at the public service answer point just to validate it. You might schedule a time to do that, so you're doing it at a quiet time. And there's other mechanisms that some carriers provide, which is like a test service such as 933, which might give you like an IVR and give you a response back just to confirm the location record data that's tied against that particular device that made the call. So there's a lot of kind of good stuff that you might want to do. And with PhoneView, again, because it all works remotely, we can use the remote audio feature. So this isn't like a full conference call like we had when you're talking to a real person. We can actually just piggyback on the audio and just get a copy of the audio from that remote phone, bring it back to your PC or another extension on the cluster, and you can listen in on the call. So not participate, but as in transmit audio, but just receive audio. And that means if you do dial 933 and you're talking to an IVR system, you can listen in and check the response, the audio response back from the IVR system that has the information that you want. And you can use like switch port information that PhoneView can gather if you want to kind of choose which phones to work with, if it's a certain switch port, etc. So it's all great for getting the physicality aspect checked out. Hot desking, again, that's something to consider, but because, again, PhoneView works with cell phones, etc., allows you to kind of test that from whatever kind of location, etc., and all the facilities you might have set up to handle those 911 scenarios. So just a reiteration of what we kind of talked about before. One little extra part is if you actually have or use the communication manager extensionability functionality, PhoneView actually can log the phone in and out as well, even without a PIN number if you give it the right permissions. So it means that you can log a user in and out of a particular device, make a call, validate the dial plan, 911, etc., all as part of that. So you can test that too. It's a table just for reference really on the different aspects of desk phones and soft phones working with PhoneView in terms of the different scenarios, on-prem, MRA, AnyConnect, and whether or not you can control it You know, can you access the settings menu, for example? You can't do that on a soft phone. You can't do it on a VPN phone or a soft phone at any kind of level. That doesn't exist, but you can still make calling operations on a soft phone. And then the view side of it to see what's happening. Image really relates to screenshots. You can get a screenshot if it's on-prem or if it's connected via VPN AnyConnect with the right permissions set up, VPN tunnel profile set up, obviously. But what you can always do, as I kind of showed a little bit earlier on that soft phone slide, you can always use that CTI rendering mechanism on desk phone or soft phone. So you can always use rendering to validate the call state. Okay, so I've really got a short demo and one slide to kind of cover. So let me flip over to that. Okay, so this is a little YouTube video. Hopefully you'll get the audio sent through. If not, when I do the recording, I'll stitch it in if you don't hear it at this time. But this is just going to show you you're working with a remote phone, this kind of blue background phone here. That's the remote phone. Using PhoneView to remotely access it, get it to dial into the public service answer point, and also to do a 933 validation. But it's got its own audio to describe what's happening. So let me just play that. Welcome. In this short demonstration, we're going to show you how to test 911 services. So if I choose a physical phone, which is remote, and I want to be able to test 911, because we need to speak to the actual operator, you can use, for example, a simple macro to dial that number and then conference in a local phone. So I've got a remote phone here. I'm going to send that macro.
Operator, what is your emergency?
Hello, this is not an emergency call. This is a test. Do you have a moment to verify my emergency information?
Certainly, please continue.
Can you verify the address that you received my call from?
I have the West Wing, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, as your location.
That's perfect. Thanks very much for your help.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
There we go. I'll just hang up the call. And so that's us able to listen in remotely by conferencing in a local phone, a soft phone in this case, or it could be a mobile phone. Simply, the macro structure here is to dial 911, wait a little while for it to connect, and immediately initiate a conference into the party who's going to join the conversation with the 911 operator, because obviously you need to have a two-way dialogue with them. Now, what you can also do, and some providers have this facility, is you can actually dial a 933 service or an equivalent to that can actually have an IVR prompt which will read back the address for you. So in this case, I'm going to again go to this remote phone. So again, this is to prove where it is. And a good thing if you're running through these devices, if you get a few of them, is we've got lots of information in terms of location, subnet, switch information that you can use to filter and select individual remote phones to work with. Now, in this case, I'm going to dial a 933 service, and it's simply going to read back location information. So if I quickly place a call, and then I'm immediately going to monitor it. So let me do that. So we call, we monitor.
Associated with this number as the West Wing, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington.
There we are. In this case, it just read out the location information for us, so we could hear that in audio and confirm that information is correct.